it ticked down to 0. Congratulations, you've won. And I'm like, oh crap, I just bought a Ferrari. So in 2019, I bought a Ferrari. I bought it on Bring a Trailer. I think any car enthusiast, they may not love Ferraris, but I think everybody has a respect for Ferraris. You can like Lamborghinis or you can like Ferraris, but I think one of the only people who might not like Ferraris is actually Ferruccio Lamborghini. Disliked him so much he started his own company, but you gotta have respect for Ferrari. I always knew I wanted to own one. To me, it seemed pretty far away, a faraway goal. Anyway, I wanted a front-engined V12 with a gated manual. Since the 275 GTB4 was a little bit out of range for me by a few $1,000,000, I went for one that I could afford. And in 2019, the 550 Maranello, which was the entire run, was all gated manuals. I figured maybe I'll take a run at one of those. And prices gotten down to the 70s and they started to creep back up to the 80s, 90s, 100s. If you look around, the higher mile cars obviously trade for less because people are afraid of high mile Ferraris. So I was looking on Bring a Trailer and there was one that was, bid into the 70s. It was a 98 in Giallo Modena, and I really dislike yellow cars. But it was a higher mile, it had 41,000 miles on it. It had traded once or was bid up to like 80 something and didn't sell. I like 8s and 3s. My birthday's August 30th. So I was like, if I can get this car with an 8 handle, I'm gonna try for it. So I bid 83, then the car bid up to 85, and I was with my friend Greg in his shop, and he's like, well, if you like it at 83, you like it at 88.3. And I was like, okay. So I bid 88.3 and ticked down to like 2 minutes. And I was like, oh, I might own this car for 80 something thousand. A bid came in for 90,000 flat. And I was like, there it goes. I'm not going to get my Ferrari with an 8 handle. It's not going to happen. And my friend Greg's like, what's the next highest bid increment? Bid that, you'll own the car. And I'm like, well, it's $500. I'm like, you gonna let this car get away from you for, $1,700 more? Than it's like, come on, you're not even gonna think about it a few years from now. And so just sort of to prove him wrong, I bid $90,500 just to prove him wrong that I wasn't gonna own the car. And then it ticked down to 0. Congratulations, you've won. And I'm like, oh crap, I just bought a Ferrari. It was an interesting time for me in my life. I had just finalized a divorce and the check for half of my house, which really worked out to be about a third of my house, came through, and it was a little more than enough to cover a Ferrari. And I figured to myself, well, I can't drive my house, but I could live in my car. The 550 is a gentleman's GT car. You could take it across country and be pretty comfortable in it for a tall guy like myself. And it had all the right things, and it was high miles, and I was gonna drive it because I don't buy cars that put in a garage. So I took delivery in the car. Started right up, there were no check engine lights, and it's a good car, driver quality, which is what I wanted. So first thing I did is I took it in for belt service. And when I took it in for belt service, I was like, with the stock exhaust on these cars, they sound like a Ferrari, but they don't sound like a Ferrari should sound. And so I did a lot of homework, and I found this Italian guy named, I'm gonna mispronounce the name, but Fabio Fiamanghetti. He did this custom 6-into-1 headers with 200 cell cats and an unmuffled center section. And I mean, it's beautiful. It's a work of art. I first started with the headers and the cats and put those on. And I was like, it sounds better, but it's not quite there. And then once I put in the unmuffled center section of this exhaust, the thing sounds proper. It sounds like a V12 Ferrari should sound. I first drove a 550 when they were new, and it felt like the flagship Ferrari. I mean, you could lay down 11s with this thing with the traction control off and smoke the tires and just his gobs of power, and it was unbelievable. But in today's standards, not quite the same. The sound of it for me is everything. And I sort of like the juxtaposition of my car being a loud color and a loud exhaust and a gentleman's GT car. And I think over time, the the unusual colors are starting to become a little more respected rather than the tried and true red Ferrari. So the yellow has definitely grown on me. I still generally have a dislike for yellow cars, but this one has certainly grown on me quite a bit. And I do love the rear 3/4 view of that car. It's sort of like a big Italian muscle car. And unbeknownst to me, when I bought the car, one of the previous owners had upgraded the front brakes on things. So I tried to put new brakes and rotors on it, bought the stock brakes and rotors, and none of it fit. So I did some homework and realized that this guy had put on bigger Brembos and bigger rotors in the front, and he also put spacers in the wheels to fill out the wheel wells a little bit. So the car looks really good. I drove it up from Delray to Tail of the Dragon, spent a weekend up there with this Smokies GT group, and they're all in GT Porsches, and I'm in this big front engine V12 gentleman's driver car with a manual transmission with my dog in the passenger seat going around these turns and Tail of the Dragon, hanging on my dog, trying to shift. But it was great. The car handled, 800-mile round trip pretty well, did its job. But shortly after that trip, on startup, I'd hear a little squealing from one of the belts, and I didn't think much of it at the time, just thought it was like a cold start kind of issue, whatever, and high mile Ferrari kind of issues. But I had the car out one night, and the dash lit up, and the motor shut down. I was like, that's not good. I don't know if you've ever tried calling AAA for picking up a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or something special, but they don't really show up on time, and nobody wants to take the risk of damaging a high-end sports car. So sit on the side of the road for a few hours, stranded by my Ferrari. I take it to a shop, and it turns out that when I had the belt service and the exhaust done, that mechanic probably over-tightened the belts. There's a certain tension spec that they need to be at. When you over-tighten them, it puts a little pressure on one of the cams for the belt pulley. And anyway, it threw a belt. And it's an interference motor, so when the motor's running without one of the belts on, you bend everything. Fortunately, I had only bent the driver's side bank. Anyway, motor came out of the car, and I had found, just by coincidence, a mechanic by the name of Sergio Ciccone. He's a little Italian dude who knows everything about everything Italian. I brought him the motor, and he kind of took it apart and showed me what the problems were and what I needed to do, and gave me a parts list. So he let me order up the parts on his account from Ricambi, and spent a few $1,000s there. And I said, hey, when you're putting this thing back together, I'd really like to be there, just because I want to know what it's like inside this motor and what's happening in there. And I call him up the next day. I'm like, hey, let me know when you're going to start working on this motor. I'd like to be a part of the process. And he's like, oh, it's done. I said, what do you mean it's done? He's like, yeah, well, I started opening up and playing around with things. The next thing you know, I put all the new valves in, and it's all ready to go. I said, you did that in a day? He goes, yeah, it's easy. He's like, I know these things. I said, well, I kind of want to be a part of it. I was like, well, what's this going to cost me? And I had no idea. I know I paid for the parts, a few $1,000s of parts. Each one of the valves, I think, is $52, and there's, 4 per cylinder. So there's a lot of those. That adds up quick. He tells me, he's like, 16. And I'm thinking to myself, 16,000? Because that's a lot. And he's like, yeah, no, 1,600. I was like, 60, you fixed my car for $1,600? Yeah, he put the whole thing back together in like a day. And then it turned out the guy who had pulled the motor out of the car was a different guy. He didn't want to get involved with doing the internal work on the motor. So I brought it back to him to put the motor back in, and that was a huge expense. He puts the whole thing back in and calls me up because I got bad news. He's like, I don't know who you had did this motor, but I started this thing. It smoked up the whole shop. Clearly it didn't do a good job. And I call up Sergio, and I said, Sergio, what's going on? He says, no. He's like, where's the car? He's like, let me go down there and take a look at it. So I go down there with him, and he spends 2 minutes and adjusts some of the throttle bodies and this and that, and fires the thing right up, and smoke clears, and the car runs beautifully. And it just takes that knowledge, this guy knows everything about these cars, and he's a great guy to know when you own a Ferrari. I'd also taken it to the Ferrari annual event, which they do every year. They had it one year in Sebring. It's the who's who of Ferrari ownership. There's 250 GTOs. David and Cooper McNeil show up with a 275 GTB and an F40. And I'm hanging out there talking to their mechanic. And Cooper McNeil's so tall, they need to modify the car so he can fit in it with a helmet on. It's cool chatting with those guys. And anyway, I'm bringing the car back. I stopped at a friend's shop, just to visit him, and I go back out to the car and start it up and won't start. I'm like, Sergio? And he's like, let me see, what happened. So I got the car flatbedded back to my house. Sergio comes over. We take the whole thing apart, and it turned out the timing had moved a little bit, and there's an internal wheel that runs the gear for the belts, and it's held in by a little keyway and a little metal piece that goes over this cog that spins the belts. He was pulling things apart and finally got into that. And this is all on quick jacks in my garage. We're taking this whole thing apart, and he shows me this little keyway. It had all been really mangled and augered, and there was enough play in it so that it moved like a millimeter, and you could see the timing hash marks on the cam that it was just off a tiny bit, and it was the play in that wheel for where that keyhole was. And I said, okay, well, how much is that part? And you look it up, and it's $3,000. And I'm like, ugh. And he goes, no, take it to my machine guy. He's like, we'll cut it. He'll figure out how to, either fill that in or weld some more metal in there to make so. Anyway, I bring this piece to this machine shop, and what he did is he just rotated 180 degrees, cut a new little hole, and fitted a new key in there, because that key is where that wheel kind of hangs onto, and that did the job. And it cost me $200. A few $100 bills to Sergio for helping me in my garage. We got the thing back in the going, and the car's got another 13,000 miles on it since that job. It's been a lot of fun. I love having the car. I feel like I've gotten through a lot of the really tough parts of ownership, but it's been a really cool experience, and nothing like the sound of that V12.
By now you know that AutoTempest is the best place to shop for your next car, because they compile all the results from all the major listing sites into one place. And of course they support the best car content on YouTube. But did you also know that AutoTempest now has a new mobile app? That's right, in addition to using it in your browser on a computer, you can also have it for iOS or Android in the palm of your hand. So check it out and download it. I know you'll love it the way I love it, and leave them a great review.